What happens when racist cops make the catastrophic mistake of handcuffing a two-star general? When they assume the distinguished black woman in the luxury SUV is just another suspicious person to intimidate and humiliate? When they discover, too late, that their victim has a direct line to the highest levels of military command? The phone call that followed would send shockwaves through law enforcement, trigger federal investigations, and ultimately destroy careers built on decades of unchecked prejudice and abuse of power. This is the story of Major General Denise Washington, a trailblazing military leader whose wrongful detention in August 2019 exposed not just individual racism, but a systemic pattern of discrimination that had been protected and enabled for years. Like Army Lieutenant Karen Nazario, who was pepper-sprayed and assaulted by Virginia police despite his military service, or the countless other black service members who have faced racial profiling while serving their country, General Washington's experience reveals a devastating truth. Wearing the uniform of the United States military offers no protection from the bias and brutality that plague American law enforcement. But Washington's story is different in one crucial way. She possessed the rank, the connections, and the institutional power to fight back in ways that most victims of police misconduct never can. Her response would trigger a reckoning that reached from a small-town police department all the way to the Pentagon, forcing a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about racism, accountability, and justice in America. What happened that summer evening in Georgia would prove that courage, determination, and institutional authority can indeed challenge injustice, but only after exposing the devastating cost of allowing discrimination to flourish unchecked for far too long. Denise Marie Washington was born in 1965 in Birmingham, Alabama, during one of the most turbulent periods in American civil rights history. Her childhood was shaped by the echoes of the Birmingham Campaign, the legacy of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and the determined resilience of a black community that refused to be broken by systematic oppression. Her father, Robert Washington, was a steel worker who had served as a sergeant in the Korean War, returning home to a segregated South that offered few opportunities for black veterans. Her mother, Catherine, was an elementary school teacher who instilled in young Denise both a love of learning and an unwavering belief that excellence was the only acceptable response to those who questioned her worth. Growing up in the 1970s and 80s, Denise witnessed her community's ongoing struggle for equality, while experiencing firsthand the intersection of racial and gender discrimination that would shape her worldview. When she announced her intention to join the military and pursue a career in logistics and operations, many questioned whether a young black woman could succeed in what remained a predominantly white, male institution. The military of the 1980s, while officially integrated since President Truman's 1948 executive order, still struggled with deeply embedded cultural biases. As documented by military historians, black women faced what researchers term double jeopardy, discrimination based on both race and gender that often made their service experience particularly challenging. Despite making up just over 1/3 of enlisted women, black women like Denise had to navigate not only the traditional barriers faced by all female service members, but also the additional burden of racial prejudice. Denise commissioned as a second lieutenant through officer candidate school in 1987, beginning a military career that would span 3 decades and multiple deployments. Her early years were marked by the same patterns documented in studies of black female officers: having her competence questioned, being excluded from informal networks, and having to work double and triple harder than her white male counterparts to prove her capabilities. Her breakthrough came during Operation Desert Storm, where her exceptional logistics coordination helped ensure supply lines remained intact during critical phases of the conflict. But even her exemplary performance was met with skepticism from some superior officers who attributed her success to luck rather than skill, a common experience for black women in military leadership positions. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Denise steadily climbed the ranks, serving in increasingly complex, assignments that took her from Fort Bragg to the Pentagon to command positions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Each promotion brought new challenges, as she often found herself the only black woman in senior leadership meetings, facing what researchers describe as the isolating experience of being a token in predominantly white male environments. By 2015, Colonel Washington had achieved what many considered impossible for a black woman from the segregated South. She was selected for promotion to Brigadier General, joining an extraordinarily elite group. Only 21 white women and 2 black women served as general officers in the entire Army as of 2022, making her achievement historically significant. Her promotion to Major General in 2018 placed her among the most senior black women ever to serve in the U.S. military, following in the footsteps of trailblazers like Marsha Anderson, who became the first African-American woman to achieve Major General rank in the Army Reserve in 2011. Washington's portfolio included oversight of military logistics operations across the southeastern United States, commanding respect from thousands of soldiers, and managing budgets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But despite her extraordinary accomplishments and the respect she commanded within military circles, General Washington remained acutely aware that outside the confines of military installations, her rank and service meant little to those who saw only her skin color. Like many black military officers, she had experienced suspicious looks while shopping in uniform, questioning glances when she appeared at military events, and the subtle but persistent message that her presence in positions of authority was, somehow, anomalous. The broader context of her career included a military that was still grappling with issues of diversity and inclusion. While the armed forces had made significant progress since integration, studies continued to document disparities in promotion rates, disciplinary actions, and career opportunities for black service members, particularly women. General Washington had spent her career breaking barriers, but she was also painfully aware of how much work remained to be done. On the evening of August 15, 2019, all of her achievements, all of her years of distinguished service, all of her hard-earned rank and authority would mean nothing to the police officers who were about to make the most expensive mistake of their careers. The evening began with what should have been a routine drive home from a conference at Fort Benning, Georgia. Major General Denise Washington, still in her dress uniform after delivering the keynote address to a gathering of military logistics officers, was traveling north on Interstate 185 in her black BMW X5 when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. It was 8:47 p.m. on a humid August evening, and the traffic stop occurred in Russell County, Alabama, just across the state line from Georgia. Washington pulled into a well-lit gas station parking lot, following the safety protocols she had learned, both through military training and the painful wisdom shared among black families about surviving police encounters. The officers who approached her vehicle were Sergeant Mike Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of the Russell County Sheriff's Department, and Deputy Trevor Jackson, a relative newcomer with just 3 years on the force. Neither officer had any idea they were about to detain one of the highest-ranking black women in the United States military. "License and registration," Reynolds barked through Washington's partially lowered window, his flashlight beam shining directly into her eyes. The general, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her through combat deployments and Pentagon briefings, slowly reached for her documents. "Good evening, officers. May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" Washington asked in her measured professional tone, the same voice that had commanded military briefings and congressional hearings. Reynolds's response revealed the assumptions that would soon destroy his career. "Don't get smart with me, lady. You were speeding, and this vehicle matches the description of one involved in a robbery earlier today." What Reynolds failed to realize, and what would later be revealed through internal investigations, was that no robbery had been reported in the area. The suspicious vehicle call was fabricated, a common practice used by some officers to justify questionable stops. What the officers saw was a well-dressed black woman in an expensive SUV, and their biases filled in a narrative that justified their actions. "I'm Major General Washington, United States Army. she said, offering her military identification alongside her driver's license. "I was not speeding, and I'm returning from an official function at Fort Benning." Jackson, the younger officer, seemed confused by Washington's rank and credentials, but Reynolds remained aggressive. "I don't care what you claim to be. Step out of the vehicle now." The situation escalated when Washington, following protocols she had learned from other black military officers who had faced similar situations, requested to see a supervisor and asked if she could call her command. Reynolds interpreted this reasonable request as resistance. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Reynolds declared. Despite Washington having committed no crime and fully cooperating with the investigation, what happened next would be captured on the officer's body cameras and patrol car dash cams, creating a permanent record of what federal investigators would later describe as egregious misconduct motivated by racial bias. Reynolds forcibly removed Washington from her vehicle, pushing the two-star general against the hood of her BMW, while Jackson fumbled with handcuffs. The sight of a distinguished military officer in dress uniform being manhandled like a common criminal created a striking visual contrast that would later prove devastatingly effective in federal court. "You have no right to arrest me," Washington said firmly, her military bearing intact even as the handcuffs cut into her wrists. "I demand to speak to your supervisor and to contact my command." Reynolds' response revealed both his ignorance and his contempt. "I don't give a damn about your command or whatever game you're playing. You're going to jail." For 23 minutes, Major General Washington, a woman who commanded thousands of soldiers and managed critical military operations, sat, handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, while Reynolds and Jackson searched her vehicle without consent or probable cause. The officers found nothing suspicious because there was nothing to find. Washington's SUV contained military documents, a change of civilian clothes, and the ceremonial sword she had been presented at the Fort Benning event. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Lisa Martinez, a supervisor responding to the scene, recognized the significance of Washington's rank and credentials. Martinez, a 12-year veteran with military experience herself, immediately understood the magnitude of the situation her subordinates had created. "Uncuff her now," Martinez ordered Reynolds, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "And somebody better have a damn good explanation for this." But the damage was already done. For nearly half an hour, one of America's most distinguished military officers had been treated like a criminal, subjected to the kind of humiliation and degradation that no person, let alone a major general, should ever endure. As the handcuffs came off and Washington began documenting the officer's badge numbers and patrol car information, Reynolds made one final mistake that would seal his fate. "Next time, maybe don't drive a car you can't afford," he said, revealing the racial assumptions that had driven the entire encounter. Washington's response was measured but devastating. "Officer Reynolds, you have just created a federal incident involving the unlawful detention of a United States Army general. This will be reported through appropriate military and civilian channels, and I assure you that your conduct tonight will be thoroughly investigated." The 47-minute ordeal officially ended when Washington was released without charges, apologies, or any acknowledgement of wrongdoing from Reynolds or Jackson. But as her BMW pulled out of the gas station parking lot, both officers remained unaware that they had just triggered a series of events that would ultimately destroy their careers and expose systemic problems within their department. Washington drove the remaining 90 minutes to her home, her hands still bearing the marks from the handcuffs, her uniform disheveled from the forcible arrest, and her mind already focused on the calls she would need to make. As a two-star general, she possessed something that most victims of police misconduct lacked: direct access to the highest levels of military and civilian leadership, and the institutional authority to demand accountability. The first call would be to her commanding officer. The second would be to the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General. The third would be to a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases involving federal employees. By sunrise, Major General Washington's wrongful detention would become a federal matter involving multiple agencies, congressional oversight, and media attention that would ultimately force a reckoning with issues of racial bias in law enforcement that had been ignored for far too long. The hours following her release marked the beginning of a grueling journey that would test not only Washington's resolve, but also the military's commitment to protecting its own officers from civilian law enforcement misconduct. Her first call, placed at 11:23 p.m. from her home office, was to Lieutenant General Marcus Thompson, her immediate superior at Army Materiel Command. "Sir, this is General Washington. I need to report a significant incident involving my unlawful detention by civilian police officers approximately 2 hours ago," she began, her voice steady despite the trauma she had endured. Thompson's response was immediate and decisive. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? And has this been documented?" Within hours, the incident had been reported through military channels to the Pentagon, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, and the Inspector General's office. But Washington quickly discovered that while the military bureaucracy moved swiftly to document and investigate, the civilian justice system presented far more complex challenges. Her second call was to Attorney Sarah Mitchell, a former JAG officer who specialized in civil rights violations against federal employees. Mitchell's initial assessment was sobering. "General, what happened to you was clearly unlawful, but prosecuting police officers for civil rights violations is notoriously difficult. We'll need to build an overwhelming case." The days that followed revealed the psychological toll of the incident. Washington, who had commanded troops in combat zones and navigated complex Pentagon politics, found herself experiencing symptoms she had never encountered before. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by flashbacks to the moment the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Routine interactions with security personnel triggered anxiety responses that left her shaken and furious at her own vulnerability. "I've been shot at in Afghanistan," she confided to her longtime friend and fellow General Patricia Rivers during a secure phone call. "But this felt different. In combat, you know who the enemy is. This was my own country treating me like criminal because of the color of my skin." The institutional response from the military was swift and comprehensive. Army Chief of Staff General James McConville personally called Washington to express his support and ensure that the incident received the highest levels of attention. The Army's Inspector General launched a formal investigation into whether Washington's civil rights had been violated while she was performing official duties. But the Russell County Sheriff's Department initially circled the wagons around Reynolds and Jackson. Sheriff Tom Bradley's first public statement defended his officers' actions as appropriate responses to a traffic stop involving a suspicious vehicle and an uncooperative subject. The statement made no mention of Washington's rank, her military service, or the fact that she had been fully cooperative throughout the encounter. Washington's decision to go public with her story came after learning that Reynolds and Jackson had been involved in similar incidents with other black motorists. Her attorney had uncovered evidence of a pattern of racial profiling within the department, including 3 other cases in the previous year where black drivers had been detained without cause and released without charges. "This isn't about me personally," Washington said during her first media interview, appearing on CNN 3 weeks after the incident. "This is about a pattern of behavior that treats black Americans as inherently suspicious, regardless of their service to this country or their standing in the community." The interview, which was viewed more than 2 million times within 48 hours, sparked national conversations about racial profiling and the treatment of black military personnel by civilian law enforcement. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and military families flooded social media with similar stories, revealing the scope of a problem that had largely remained hidden from public view. The political pressure intensified when Congressman John Lewis, the civil rights icon and veteran activist, requested a formal hearing on discrimination against military personnel by local law enforcement. In a letter to the House Armed Services Committee, Lewis wrote, When our most distinguished military officers cannot travel safely through American communities without facing unlawful detention and harassment, we have failed both our service members and our constitutional principles. Washington's own resistance took multiple forms. She worked with military investigators to provide detailed testimony about the incident, submitted to multiple debriefings with federal law enforcement agencies, and authorized the release of all video evidence from the scene. More importantly, she used her platform as a senior general to speak out about broader issues of discrimination that affected thousands of Black service members. "We ask our military personnel to defend democracy abroad," she said during a speech at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual convention. But what does it mean when they cannot experience that democracy safely at home? The personal cost was significant. Washington found herself under intense scrutiny from both supporters and critics, with some questioning whether she should have used her military position to highlight civilian law enforcement issues. Conservative media outlets criticized her for playing the race card, while some military colleagues expressed concerns about the attention her case was bringing to military-civilian relations. The most difficult moments came when Washington learned about retaliation against other military personnel who had spoken out in support of her case. 2 junior officers reported being passed over for promotions after publicly supporting Washington's decision to file federal complaints. A Black female sergeant described being subjected to increased scrutiny from her chain of command after sharing Washington's CNN interview on social media. "They're trying to make an example of anyone who speaks up," Washington confided to her attorney during a strategy session. "But that's exactly why we can't back down. If a 2-star general can't get justice, what hope do junior enlisted personnel have?" The breakthrough came when the FBI's Civil Rights Division announced it was opening a formal investigation into the Russell County Sheriff's Department's practices. The federal investigation would examine not just Washington's case, but the broader pattern of discrimination that her incident had brought to light. For Washington, the announcement represented both vindication and responsibility. Her decision to fight back had opened doors for other victims, but it had also thrust her into a role she had never sought, becoming the face of a movement to reform police-military relations and ensure that wearing the uniform truly meant something. In civilian encounters, the turning point came on November 15, 2019, during what was supposed to be a routine federal court hearing in Montgomery, Alabama. What unfolded instead was a dramatic confrontation that would permanently alter the careers of everyone involved and send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the South. Federal Judge Patricia Williams had called the hearing to review evidence in Washington's civil rights lawsuit against the Russell County Sheriff's Department. The courtroom was packed with media, civil rights advocates, military personnel, and law enforcement officials, all aware that the case had implications far beyond one incident. The day's first surprise came when FBI Special Agent Rebecca Chen took the stand to present findings from the Bureau's 3-month investigation into the Sheriff's Department. What she revealed was a pattern of systematic abuse that went far beyond racial profiling. It constituted what federal prosecutors would later describe as a criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights. Over the past 5 years, Agent Chen testified, "We have documented 47 instances of unlawful detention, excessive force, and discriminatory enforcement targeting African American citizens. These incidents follow a clear pattern of racial bias and abuse of authority. The evidence was devastating. The FBI had uncovered text messages between department personnel containing explicit racial slurs and discussions of targeting Black drivers. Internal emails revealed that supervisors were aware of these practices and had actively concealed them from county oversight. Most damning of all, the investigation had uncovered evidence that Reynolds and Jackson had fabricated the suspicious vehicle report that led to Washington's detention. Defense attorney Marcus Cole, representing the Sheriff's Department, attempted damage control. These allegations represent isolated incidents involving a few bad actors, not systemic problems, within our department. But Agent Chen's next revelation destroyed that narrative entirely. The FBI had obtained recordings of Sheriff Tom Bradley himself using racial epithets and instructing deputies to keep the pressure on certain communities. The recordings, made during what Bradley thought were private conversations, captured him explicitly ordering increased traffic stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. The courtroom erupted when the recordings were played. Bradley, sitting in the front row, visibly paled as his own voice filled the room. "I don't care what reasons you have to give for the stops. Just make sure these people know we're watching them." Judge Williams called for order, but the damage was irreversible. Sheriff Bradley, who had spent months defending his department and minimizing Washington's claims, was now exposed as the architect of the discriminatory policies that had led to her detention. The day's most dramatic moment came when General Washington herself took the stand. Wearing her dress blue uniform with its array of ribbons and decorations, she presented a striking contrast to the disgraced law enforcement. Officials seated at the defense table. "Your Honor," Washington began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military leadership. "This case is not just about what happened to me on August 15th. It's about a system that has operated with impunity for years, violating the rights of citizens and disgracing the badge of law enforcement." Her testimony was clinical and devastating. She detailed not just her own experience, but connected it to the broader pattern of abuse that the FBI investigation had uncovered. She presented evidence of 23 other black military personnel who had experienced similar treatment in Russell County over the previous 3 years, cases that had never been reported or investigated. These officers saw a black woman in an expensive car and immediately assumed criminality, Washington testified. "They never considered that I might be a patriot, a public servant, or a person deserving of basic respect. Their prejudice blinded them to everything except the color of my skin." The hearing's climax came when Reynolds and Jackson were called to testify under oath. Both officers, now facing federal civil rights charges, attempted to claim their actions were justified and race-neutral. But under cross-examination by federal prosecutors, their stories crumbled. Reynolds, forced to explain his comment about Washington driving a car she couldn't afford, finally admitted, "I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made." Jackson, confronted with evidence that he had participated in similar stops targeting black drivers, broke down entirely. "I was following orders. I thought that was what was expected." The proceedings concluded with Judge Williams making an extraordinary statement from the bench. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of a pattern and practice of discriminatory law enforcement that violates both federal civil rights statutes and the constitutional rights of American citizens. The actions documented in this case represent not just individual misconduct, but institutional failure at every level." Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, the Russell County Sheriff's Department was placed under federal oversight. Sheriff Bradley announced his resignation, effective immediately. Reynolds and Jackson were terminated and would later face federal criminal charges that would result in prison sentences. But perhaps most importantly, General Washington's courage in fighting back had exposed a system of oppression that had operated in the shadows for years, protected by silence and enabled by institutional indifference. Her victory represented not just personal vindication, but a watershed moment in the fight for accountability in American law enforcement. The aftermath of the federal court proceedings transformed not only the Russell County Sheriff's Department, but also established precedents that would reshape police-military relations across the United States. Within 6 months of Judge Williams's ruling, the Department of Justice had launched investigations into 12 other law enforcement agencies following similar complaints from military personnel. Sheriff Tom Bradley's resignation was just the beginning of the institutional changes that Washington's case catalyzed. The federal oversight agreement required the Russell County Sheriff's Department to undergo comprehensive reform, including mandatory bias training, body camera requirements, and the establishment of an independent citizen review board. Most significantly, the department was required to implement specific protocols for interactions with military personnel, recognizing their federal status and service. Reynolds and Jackson faced the full weight of federal justice. Reynolds was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for violating Washington's civil rights under color of law, while Jackson received 18 months for his role in the conspiracy. Both men also faced civil liability in Washington's lawsuit, which was settled for $2.3 million, money that came from the officers' personal assets and insurance policies, not taxpayer funds. For Washington personally, the victory came with profound costs and unexpected rewards. The stress of the prolonged legal battle, combined with the intense media scrutiny, accelerated her decision to retire from active duty in 2021, 2 years earlier than originally planned. But her post-military career has been devoted to ensuring that her experience leads to lasting change. As president of the Military Justice Foundation, a nonprofit organization she established in 2020, Washington has become a national advocate for service members facing discrimination. The foundation has handled more than 300 cases involving military personnel who experienced racial profiling or misconduct by civilian law enforcement, achieving settlements and policy changes in 85% of cases pursued. What happened to me was devastating, but it was also an opportunity, Washington reflected during a 2023 interview. If my rank and resources could create change, then I had an obligation to use them not just for myself, but for every service member who doesn't have those advantages. The broader impact of Washington's case extends far beyond individual incidents. The Pentagon now maintains a database of law enforcement encounters involving military personnel, and the Military Justice Foundation's advocacy led to the passage of the Military Personnel Protection Act in 2022. The federal legislation requires local law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement specific training protocols for interactions with active duty and veteran personnel. Perhaps, most significantly, Washington's case has influenced military recruitment and retention policies. Studies conducted by the Defense Department found that high-profile incidents of discrimination against military personnel negatively impact recruitment, particularly among minority communities. The Pentagon now includes anti-discrimination advocacy as part of its community outreach efforts, working with local law enforcement to prevent the kind of incidents that drove Washington's case. The Russell County Sheriff's Department, under new leadership and federal oversight, has become an unlikely model for reform. Sheriff Maria Rodriguez, who replaced Bradley, has implemented community policing initiatives that have dramatically reduced complaints and improved relations with minority communities. The department now conducts joint training exercises with nearby military installations, building relationships that prevent misunderstandings and promote mutual respect. Washington's influence extends to military leadership development as well. Her case is now studied in military ethics courses, and she regularly speaks at service academies about the intersection of military service and civil rights. Her message to young officers is consistent. Wearing the uniform is both a privilege and a responsibility. You serve not just in foreign deployments, but in the communities where you live, and you have an obligation to ensure that all Americans can experience the freedom you defend. The legal precedents established by Washington's case continue to influence civil rights litigation nationwide. Federal courts now regularly cite the Russell County decision in cases involving discrimination against federal employees, and the DOJ has used similar approaches to investigate other law enforcement agencies with patterns of bias. On August 15, 2024, 5 years to the day after her wrongful detention, General Washington was invited to speak at the Russell County Sheriff's Department's annual community forum. The invitation, extended by Sheriff Rodriguez, represented a full-circle moment that demonstrated how individual courage can catalyze institutional transformation. Change is possible, Washington told the audience, which included many of the same community members who had witnessed the discrimination she challenged. But it requires people willing to fight for what's right, even when the cost is high. That's what we do in the military, and that's what we must do as citizens. Major General Denise Washington's story illuminates a fundamental truth about American democracy. Justice is not automatic, equality is not guaranteed, and progress requires the courage of individuals willing to challenge systems of oppression, regardless of the personal cost. Her wrongful detention by racist police officers was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of discrimination that had operated unchecked for years, protected by institutional silence, and enabled by the assumption that victims would not have the resources or authority to fight back. Washington's decision to resist, to demand accountability, and to use her platform to expose broader injustices transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change. The officers who handcuffed a two-star general learned that power without accountability is ultimately powerless against determined resistance. Their careers were destroyed, not just by their racist actions, but by their failure to recognize that the America they claim to protect is one where merit, service, and dignity must be respected regardless of race. Washington's victory represents more than personal vindication. It demonstrates that when individuals with privilege and platform choose to fight for justice, they can create ripple effects that benefit countless others who lack those advantages. Her Military Justice Foundation continues to defend service members facing discrimination, ensuring that her individual struggle becomes part of a broader movement for equality. But perhaps the most important lesson from Washington's story is that wearing the uniform of the United States military, or any symbol of service to our democracy, must mean something in every American community. When our most distinguished public servants cannot travel safely through their own country without facing harassment and humiliation, we have failed not just them, but the principles they have devoted their lives to defending. The fight for equality requires vigilance, courage, and the unwavering belief that America can and must do better. General Washington's story proves that individual acts of resistance can indeed change the world, one badge, one department, and one injustice at a time.